Thank you for joining us. Coming up on the show today, we have lots of news and safety tips, including a general aviation pilot is headed to jail for 10 months after violating an FAR. Cirrus Aircraft receives a production certificate for a new aircraft. A judge has lifted an injunction, and a famous Southern California air show will be held this weekend after all. And a tragic fatal crash last week in a Cirrus that seems all too familiar and totally avoidable, which is why we'll talk later about why new airplane owners often crash soon after they've purchased a plane. We'll also hear from an expert on how to inspect a Cessna 182 for a common type of damage. Plus listener mail, including an aeronautical engineering student asking about flying cars. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about, yes, you guessed it, general aviation. I'm Max Trescott, and I'm here to share my over 40 years of experience as a licensed pilot to share news and safety tips to help you fly safely. And a quick update, I spoke in the last episode about flight planning my trip to take a DA-42 Diamond Twin Star down to Texas. Now that trip did happen, and I will tell you about that trip, but in an upcoming episode. But if you want to see photos of the trip now, just follow me in Twitter. Look for Max Trescott. And special thanks to the 11 people who left iTunes reviews last week. I've picked 2 reviews, and I'll read them at the end of the show. And if I could ask you just one thing before we get started here, please help us grow this show together. Invite more of your friends to join and listen. And I'll tell you at the end of the program how to use your iPhone to share the episode. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AvWeb, a former pilot is headed for jail. A federal judge in Los Angeles accepted the plea bargain of Arnie Gerald Leto III on Monday, that's last week, sentencing him to 10 months in jail for flying passengers without a pilot certificate. At least one of those flights was in a Falcon 10 and at least one flight in a Cessna Citation II. Leto lost his certificate in early 2016 for flying paying passengers in the Cessna Citation II without possessing the required type rating and without a second pilot, as is required by that aircraft's type certificate. The Cessna Citation II can be operated single pilot with an exemption from the FAA, but Leto did not have one. The FAA determined the flight was also subject to Part 135, and Leto's company, Aviation Financial Services, did not possess a valid air carrier or commercial operator certificate. The sentencing memorandum written by the U.S. Attorney notes that this may be the first case ever of someone sent to jail for flying in air transportation without a license. Mr. Leto may have actually avoided jail time in this case, but for his other criminal activity both before and after the illicit flying. The U.S. Attorney also said more troubling is the fact that the defendant was arrested in August 2016 for transportation of approximately 500 pounds of marijuana, and that arrest occurred while the defendant had been on pretrial release. From NewsChannel10.com, federal investigators are looking into what caused a deadly plane crash in Connecticut at the Meriden-Markham Municipal Airport last week. According to police, the 56-year-old pilot, who was a doctor, died at the scene. His 21-year-old son is recovering at the Yale New Haven Hospital with a broken femur. According to the NTSB investigator Todd Gunter, witnesses said that in the first set of landings, the aircraft appeared to go faster than normal, bounced approximately twice, took off again, and then went around the track pattern and came around again for another set of landings. In the second set of landings, witnesses told the NTSB the aircraft touched down again, but this time not as fast. However, witnesses told NTSB that the aircraft flared and began bouncing, where it became airborne, rolled to the left, and then impacted where it ended up in the roadway damaged. The doctor previously owned a Piper Archer 180 horsepower aircraft for about 11 years and is said to have about 1,300 hours of experience. He apparently purchased the Cirrus SR22 just 22 days before the crash. Now, one person noted on a forum that the problem here at this airport is there is a 300 to 400 foot hill on the north end of the runway. So when coming into runway 18, it's natural to stay a bit high as that hill appears close, and the runway is only 3,100 feet. Well, to me, this is a tragic pattern that I have seen and have written about in the past, and we'll talk a little bit later in the show about why purchasers of new aircraft are at particular danger and things they can do to help try and stay safe in those first few days after they buy an aircraft. And from Southern California, the 2017 Planes of Fame Air Show at the Chino Airport will be held this weekend, May 6th through the 7th, after a group that was suing the sponsor drops its request for an injunction after the event had been scheduled. According to a story in General Aviation News, the plaintiffs will continue to seek speedy legal action in a dispute they claim stems from the Planes of Fame Air Museum's, quote, intentional attempts to physically block and obstruct other businesses before, during, and after the air show, end of quote. AOPA reported on April 6th that the Yanks Air Museum, Flying Tigers Aviation, SoCal MRO, Zhangane Aeronautics, and AFT Center filed a lawsuit alleging that their businesses suffer losses throughout a 9-day period required to set up the air show, stage it, and dismantle its infrastructure. So the show will go on, but the lawsuits will continue. From Flying Magazine, from my good friend, senior editor Rob Mark. Rob says that there's a report posted this week on the City of Santa Monica's website which identifies safety problems with a plan to shorten runways 321 per the city's January agreement with the FAA. According to the report, depending upon which of two potential design configurations are chosen, the amount of safety buffer area for aircraft departing runway 21 could be as much as 500 feet shorter. Also, other operational concerns claim that the shortened runway will not include runway end identification lights or precision approach path indicators, which of course is called a PAPI. One source said the altered runway would demand aircraft back taxi and then make a 180-degree turn before lining up on the runway, which, by the way, makes no sense to me. I've flown to Santa Monica many times, and there's certainly a lot of taxiway space. I don't understand why they would do something that would require back taxi to take off. It finishes by saying the City of Santa Monica is scheduled to consider runway options after hearing public comments at a May 2nd meeting. The city is then expected to identify its final design choice on May 24th. From NBAA.org, and this is fairly ironic, 3 new RNAV approach procedures into the Santa Monica Municipal Airport will go into effect later this week, dramatically expanding access to Southern California Airfield in adverse weather conditions. The story says the new procedures follow more than 2 years of engagement by NBAA with the FAA. According to Heidi Williams, the NBAA's Director of Air Traffic Services and Infrastructure, before these new procedures, only a non-precision VOR circling approach was available. Effective April 27, when this approach goes into effect, it should improve dramatically access to SMO, of course, the Santa Monica Airport. From PE.com, which is the press enterprise, it could take some years to accomplish, but the Banning City Council took the first steps on April 25th to close its municipal airport. Now, Banning Airport is on the highway, the interstate, which connects Los Angeles to Palm Springs. According to this, the vote was 4-1. According to the report, the airport saw a traffic drop of 71% from 2010 to 2015, from 4,600 flights to 1,300 flights. The mayor, who's on the airport subcommittee, said the site has potential for industrial or inland port reuse, and the city manager and economic development director have participated in discussions to try and reuse this 154-acre site for economic development. The public works director said that while income from hangar rentals and fuel sales cover airport expenses, we don't generate enough to improve buildings which are not eligible for FAA grants. From AOPA.org, GPS jamming in Alaska, it might not be as bad as it looks. Well, according to AOPA, this is another sign of spring, the start of military training exercises. This year's exercise, called Northern Edge, is scheduled from May the 1st through May the 12th, and it includes an extended plan for GPS jamming. And according to AOPA, even though the plans for jamming are directional in nature, the FAA requires that the NOTAM cover the impact as if the jamming were taking place in all directions. Consequently, we now have an impact that has a radius of several hundred miles at altitude. There's a diagram of the predicted impact of jamming in all directions from ground locations in restricted area R2205 in the Chena Hot Springs. Now, jamming is planned to take place only to the northeast of those locations. But since the jamming can interfere with aircraft navigations, provisions have been made to cease operation should an emergency arise. ATC will have a direct line of communications to stop jamming and confirm the jammers are off within 60 seconds of receiving the request. In the event of a safety of flight issue, pilots should contact ATC. From Flying Magazine again, the FAA has awarded Cirrus Aircraft a production certificate for the SF-50 Vision, the world's first single-engine personal jet aimed at pilots who want to fly themselves at turbine speeds and the flight levels. Now, this approval will let Cirrus accelerate aircraft deliveries as Vision jets move down their production line at the company headquarters in Duluth, Minnesota. Cirrus currently has about 600 orders for the jet, which earned FAA certification last October, and it's expected to receive European approval from EASA soon. Now, if you're not familiar with it, the Vision is intended as a single pilot-friendly personal airplane that has 7 seats, 300-knot cruise speed, service ceiling of 28,000 feet, and the first full airframe parachute in a jet. The Vision is really made as a step-up platform for owners of the SR22 and other high-performance piston models. It's expected to draw interest from commercial air taxi operators providing economical regional transportation. It's priced at around $2 million. It includes the Perspective touch glass cockpit as well as the Williams FJ33-5A turbine fan. In light sport and experimental aircraft news, this comes from General Aviation News. A dozen years after the FAA created the light sport aircraft category, there's finally a new leader among manufacturers of fully built LSA. Now, historically, Flight Design, which you probably know as the manufacturer of the CTLS-W and the CTLS, Flight Design has had the number one position for the last 12 years in terms of total LSA deliveries. But Cub Crafters has been moving upward the last several years, some years delivering more than 50 aircraft in a year. And as of 2016, they have moved into first place. If you look at lifetime sales of all these companies, and I'm looking at the chart here, number one, Cub Crafters. They've sold 382 aircraft, which gives them a market share of 12.3% of the LSA market. Now, Flight Design sold just 3 less aircraft, 378 for a 12.2% share. Cessna, of course, this is no longer produced. Their Skycatcher sold 269 aircraft for 8.7% share. And then finally, Czech Sport Aircraft, manufacturers of the Sport Cruiser, and you may remember this as the Piper Sport Cruiser at one point in time. They've sold 261 aircraft for an 8.4% market share. Also from General Aviation News, if you're thinking about buying and building a kit from Glasair, the Sportsman 2+2, you better do it soon. According to company officials, they've recently advised the FAA of their plans to apply for certification of the popular plane under Part 23. Now, once certification is achieved, according to the company, they expect to slowly transition out of the kit business. According to their aviation director of marketing, Rick Paul, he says, kit sales these days favor our 2-week to taxi builder assist program at the factory, but we can only accommodate around 17 of those builds a year, and prospective customers are asking if they can buy a certified Sportsman. Now, instead of the pre-molded composite construction of the original Glasair, the Glasstar was designed with a tubular steel frame enclosed in a composite skin. The wings and tails are conventional aluminum structures, and the enlarged Sportsman version of the same design features a 2+2 configuration. It adds a rear door and also has an option of 2 rear-facing passenger seats or lots of luggage space. And finally, from aeronews.net, and if you're into experimental aircraft, these are the really expensive ones. The Evolution Aircraft Company has upgraded their product line by adding 2 additional turbine models to their lineup of experimental aircraft kits. They have decided to add 2 new engines from Pratt & Whitney that will bolt right into the Evolution kit, which will give you even better performance. They say that their EVO T-550 with the PT6-21 turbine offers an incredibly efficient turbine option for hundreds of thousands less than their current EVO T-750. And the EVO T-850 with 865 horsepower, they say is the big dog. It's going to increase torque over 200 pounds, and it'll bring maximum cruise speed to close to 330 knots, which they say makes it the most incredible performing 4-place aircraft you can fly. Current production is now up to 16 aircraft per year, while the 86 Evolution was recently delivered. That's the news for this week. Coming up in a moment, what to look for when inspecting a Cessna 182 and why buyers of aircraft often crash soon after they buy an airplane. And this week, I was invited on to the Pre-Buy Guys podcast. I want to thank both Don and Adam for inviting me to be on the show. I talked mostly about the Cirrus aircraft and glass cockpits in general. So here's a little sample from that episode.
Also, on one of your podcasts, I heard you say that you could train a person from student pilot, right?
Yeah.
With his own airplane, his own Cirrus that he bought. And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've actually got a gentleman who I'm doing that with right now. Last year, I trained 2 people in SR20s, and I've done a couple of people in SR22s. With the SR20, I would say people will get their private a little bit faster than if they're in the SR22, and that's because the main difference between the 22 and the 20 from a training standpoint is that the rudder forces are much greater. And you can hear the full interview by going wherever you find podcasts and search for Pre-Buy Guys podcast. That was episode 15. Again, thanks to Adam and Don. And a couple quick notes before we get to our segment on inspecting Cessna 182s. If you are going to be in the Silicon Valley area in California on May the 11th, that's a Thursday evening, you're invited to come to Accident Wise 2017. This has turned into be one of the largest safety seminars in the country. It's the 3rd annual event, and it's going to be held at Moffett Field at NASA Ames in the conference center there. No registration required. The event starts at 6 o'clock. We've got presentations from the NASA ASRS, from AOPA on non-towered airports, and a couple other as well. So again, that's 6 p.m. You want to go to the Ellis Gate, which is at the south end of the field, and go to Building 3, the NASA Ames Conference Center. I'm also headed out the door tomorrow. I'm going to be flying to Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm going to be spending a 3-day weekend teaching at the Cirrus Pilot Proficiency Program, the CPPP, which is a national program for Cirrus pilots to attend both ground seminars as well as flight training. And I'll be up in the air with multiple pilots teaching them in their Cirrus aircraft. So if you're going to be in Knoxville, come look me up. And I've just made it easier to get to my online courses. So in the past, you had to kind of go to a couple different websites to get them. Now, pilotlearning.com is back up and in operation. Just go to pilotlearning.com and you can see the courses that I have available there for learning the G1000, learning instrument flying of the G1000, and also for learning to fly GPS and WAAS approaches with virtually any GPS that you might use. Courses range from $59 to $79. You can also pay a monthly membership of $29.95 and get access to all of the courses, or a discounted yearly membership of $299 for access to all of the courses. And I will be adding more courses shortly. We'll tell you about those when they come out. Okay, so when I was talking with Don and Adam of the Pre-Buy Guys, after they interviewed me for their podcast, I asked them to spend a few minutes talking to you about what to look for if you're thinking about buying a Cessna 182 and you're inspecting it to see if it's been damaged. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how often Cessnas end up with nose wheel landings and damage to the firewall. So listen to these 2 experts talk about what you need to do if you're inspecting a Cessna that you're thinking of purchasing, a Cessna 182. Well, Adam, Don, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yes, we appreciate it. We're interested in talking to the expert in the field, the Cirruses.
Well, a couple episodes ago, I was talking about the Cessna 182 and how people tend to think it's nose heavy, which I don't really believe it is, but how people often end up landing nose low and crunching the nose gear. Tell me, what do you guys do first when somebody comes to you to ask about an airplane? What do you do for part of your normal process? And then what do you do that might be special regarding a 182?
Well, maintenance-wise, the first thing I tell the customer, go out to the airplane. You probably have a nickel in your pocket. Well, you have a thumb if you don't have a nickel. And take your thumb and run around the back of that spinner between the spinner and the cowling and see 360 degrees if it's the same spacing. Yeah, because if there's a difference of like a quarter of an inch or so, well, maybe the cowl isn't on quite right. But there's always a chance there's a damaged, the motor mounts have damaged the firewall. And so I think it was like the mid-70s, I have it down someplace on one of our podcasts, they reinforced the firewall of the airplane, the forward bulkhead. And So it's less likely with the reinforcement that that'll have a damaged part there. But if it is, it's expensive. So that's the one thing you could do right away. And you could do it with a coin in your pocket, or you could do it with your thumb.
And so what's your advice when somebody finds an aircraft that didn't pass the nickel test? It's going to cost them more than a nickel, obviously. What do you recommend next?
Well, the next thing is to take off the cowling, and you can give us a call. We're on FaceTime if you have an Apple iPhone, or if you have Skype loaded down. Give us a call. We're always on duty on our cell phones, and we don't have to be sitting at a computer. And we will inspect that firewall with you and see if there's any wrinkles in it. And while we're there, we might as well look at the rest of the engine too, make sure there's no cracks in the cases or cylinder heads. And there's a lot of things we could look at. Basically, it's a good idea to pull that cowl off. And of course, if you're not the owner or the operator of the airplane, and if you're not an A&P mechanic, you could take the cowl off, but you can't legally put it back on.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, because if you're a mechanic, you could sign it off, take all the inspection plates off, and put them back on shore. But the owner or operator, and he's allowed to do that under owner-operator preventive maintenance.
Oh, I see. So I can put my own cowling back on, but I can't put the cowling back on somebody else's airplane.
Right, yeah, unless it's on the pre-flight checklist. If it's on the checklist, then you could do it. It's a pilot task. But if it's not on the checklist, you can't just undo inspection plates and put them back on to look at things.
So if the firewall is wrinkled, how expensive is that going to be? What's kind of the range of what it's going to take to potentially fix one of these aircraft?
Well, we got a moving target here. It depends on where you're located and what part of the country and parts availability. I mean, it's not something you're going to straighten out. Chances are you're going to replace the whole firewall. You're going to take the engine and all the lines off, and you're going to have to break the static system, and you got quite a lot of stuff to do. And basically, an average small airport that isn't a big major repair facility, they're going to be time and material. And as far as getting a replacement firewall or having the mechanic issue a major repair form, that's an FAA Form 337 with the repair box checked. I mean, now we're getting into it because he's going to have to design a fix and get it approved by Cessna. And we could talk $2,000 in engineering before you even start working on the airplane if the part isn't available.
Okay, I got it. So if the part's not available, then you've got to re-engineer it. Then you're paying engineering cost on top of all the other time and material. So let's just assume there is a part available. I mean, how long would you think this whole process would typically take?
It depends on the skill of the mechanic and the shop he's working in, the kind of tools he has. But I would say the minimum would be a whole week down. I would say the minimum probably be 40 hours. That's just an educated guess. There's a lot of variables here. So
a bare minimum of 40 hours then to replace the firewall, and I'm guessing it could go much, much longer as well.
Yeah, because you could run into problems, with the skin. You might find cracks in the skin, and you might have to put a modification of the frame and around the firewall and the skin around the firewall. So all kinds of little things could crop up that adds to the expense and cause more time. So you just can't say 40 hours times like $75 an hour or something like that. Can't just say it that way. Yeah, it's probably better to take that airplane to a major repair shop. There's one in Ohio there that specializes in all kinds of parts for Cessna 182s, and that's probably the place to be. And you can get a fare permit in most cases to get the airplane there.
So how is that going to play out in a typical pre-purchase scenario? As an advisor, are you going to tell the potential buyer that he should be negotiating the cost of who pays for this and how that's going to be handled? Or are you more inclined to just say, walk away from this, run, what would you tell somebody?
Well, the inspection stops right there. Sometimes on the very first few hours, the inspection stops, and we're going to say, what's our next choice? I always recommend you have at least 2 or 3 airplanes you're evaluating together, and because it's a lot easier, and you could show the owner of the airplane that you're rejecting, you're going to go to this next airplane unless we could work out a deal here. And I would say in a deal like this with a damage to a firewall, say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll continue our inspection if you're willing to take that airplane and give them a blank check at this maintenance facility that I select to fix this airplane. If you're not willing to do that, we're going to just skip off here to the next airplane.
Good. That makes a lot of sense, because ultimately you've got a fair amount of power as the buyer. You've got the money, and so you can choose not to spend it. So what you're saying really is you've got to put the responsibility back on the seller. The seller has to understand that they have essentially a defective product. But someone might be willing to go ahead and continue purchasing the aircraft if, for example, they really love that particular aircraft, or, maybe they really want to get a deal. Now, I hate saying that because I'm guessing a lot of aircraft that seem like a deal, turn out not to be a deal. What's the downside of, proceeding with the purchase of an aircraft like this that does have some damage, even if the seller does agree to give a blank check to the repair facility you designate?
It's not uncommon that it's a one-of-a-kind airplane. And this airplane just came out to be the colors you like, the interior you like, the avionics you like, and the times on the airframe and engine you like. So we could proceed, with the pre-purchase inspection and come up with additional squawk lists, and then you could make your deal. And, it's if the owner says, well, I'll tell you what, buddy, I'm not going to give you a blank check. I'm going to give you $4,000. Okay. Well, you can still buy the airplane, but we got to take some pictures and bring it. We got to negotiate with the facility who's going to fix the airplane. And then any other damage that might come up will be on the buyer's nickel. But we got to kind of get a comfortable feeling of this.
Right. So I think what I'm hearing from you is that if there's something special about this aircraft, either it's relatively rare, there aren't many of them around, or you just fell in love with it because, it's, robin egg blue color that you absolutely love and it's going to match your car. I'm being a little silly here. But if it's a 182, gosh, there must be hundreds of those available around the country. Unless you have a lot of time to spare, or unless you really are trying to buy something at rock bottom price, sounds like in that case for a 182, you'd suggest folks just move on.
Yeah, in most cases that'd be true. But it's amazing to me how first-time airplane buyers, do their homework, do their research, and they come up with some really good buys when they call us up. And the only time it becomes a bad buy is after we look into it. We start off with office research, and if they like to do it that way, we start off with a FA file check. We get the airworthiness and registration file, and we see if it's been, since the day it's been new, if it's been in a corrosive environment, at least so the owner lives in those corrosive environments. And then we kind of tailor our pre-buy inspection, knowing the history of the airplane. And we also like to get a copy of the logbooks, and if not possible, we can screenshot copy of the logbooks when we're doing that virtual pre-buy inspection, if they want to go that way. But a lot of owners today with with the phone the camera right in their phone, they can snap the pictures we want and send it to us, and we could study that, especially the AD list. We have to go over that ahead of time. So before we actually get to the airplane, we know a lot about it.
That's excellent. Well, Don and Adam, thanks so much for coming on the show today to talk to us a little bit about what people might want to do if they're searching for a 182 and they encounter a crunched firewall. Tell me, how do people find your podcast? What's the best way to find it?
Well, the podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and you can check it out on YouTube. And you can also visit us at airplaneintelpodcast.com. And that's actually our website for the pre-buys as well. So everything you'll need is right there for us.
I'm going to give my number, and Adam will give his number. My number is 910-528-7769.
Sure, and my direct line is area code 904-290-3870.
Okay, thanks very much. There you have it, the pre-buy guys. And coming up next, we'll talk about why new airplane owners often crash right after they've purchased an aircraft. And listener mail. What's up with all this talk about flying cars? We'll be back in a moment. So I have to confess, the story that I read earlier of a doctor who purchased a Cirrus SR22 and 22 days later died in it while practicing touch and goes, that story really struck a nerve with me because it's the kind of thing I've seen over and over and over again, and it doesn't have to happen. So I thought I'd take a few minutes and just talk about why is it that so many people end up crashing aircraft either on the way home while they're, after they've just purchased the aircraft or within the first few weeks after they buy it. So a few years ago, I put together a presentation on how to buy an aircraft, and that's because at the time I was an investor in a Cirrus dealership here in Northern California, which has since gone. But at the time, I was curious about safety in newly purchased aircraft. So I went online and I did searches. And if you've never been to the NTSB databases, you ought to head out there sometime and take a look at their aviation database. So what I did is I put in this keyword, recently purchased. So I just took that phrase, recently purchased. I searched the database and I searched for a 10-year period. Now, at the time I did it, it was from the period 1999 to 2009. And in that 10-year period, there were 66 fatal accidents which used the words recently purchased as a phrase in the accident report. Not only that, there were more than 100 non-fatal accidents that also had that phrase. Now, there were so many of those, I gave up on counting them. There might have been 200, I don't know, but there were just too many to count. So what that really tells you is there's a problem out there, folks. When you buy an airplane, you may not realize that you are at higher risk than usual. Now, sadly, many of these accidents occurred on the flight home. To me, it's just tragic. Somebody's life's dream. They want to buy an airplane. Wow, they finally got it. And then they die on the way home. Also, many of these accidents were with a CFI on board, which also, seems particularly tragic. So looking at some of the factors in those 66 fatal accidents, I looked at the percentages of a number of different things. So 27% of these aircraft were home built or experimental. By the way, home built and experimental have a much higher accident rate than certificated aircraft. And mostly it's in the mechanical category. So these aircraft are more likely to have mechanical issues. Of these 66 fatal accidents, 25% were stalls that occurred either during takeoff or landing. And of course, the incident we just talked about in Connecticut was a landing accident. 23% of these fatal accidents occurred on the very first flight or on the trip home. So about a quarter of all the accidents on the way home. 18% of them were mechanical. Now, that's a particularly high percentage. I think that if you look at all general aviation accidents, you're going to find mechanicals are probably less than 15%, maybe around 12% of all accidents. 15% of the accidents were at night. 15% had a CFI on board. 15% were weather-related. Now, that doesn't surprise me because I think many people decide that they've got to go out, pick up this aircraft over the weekend, fly 1,000 miles, get back home before they have to get to work on Monday. And unfortunately, if there's bad weather out there and they're thinking about that job that they need to be at on Monday, they may make bad decisions and go flying in bad weather. 14% of the accidents were in maneuvering flight. 12% were fuel-related. By the way, that's almost identical to the percentage nationally of all fuel-related accidents. If you look at all accidents, about 12% are fuel-related. Now, this is amazing to me. 8% of these were in-flight breakup. Can you imagine that? Almost 10% of the accidents, the aircraft broke up in flight. And finally, 5% of them were doing aerobatics in these newly purchased aircraft. Some of the factors that were involved, and this was basically reading through all 66 of these and looking for common threads. Some of the factors were lack of aircraft familiarity. And so often I read stories of pilots who took along someone to fly back home with them, and often that person did not have experience in the particular aircraft. Many of them were, 10,000-hour airline captains. Many of them were flight instructors, but many of them had zero time in the aircraft being purchased. People, I got to tell you, what's most important in determining safety in an aircraft and the accident rate is how many hours you have in type, how many hours you have in that particular type of aircraft. Doesn't matter if you have 10,000 hours. If those 10,000 hours are in other aircraft, it really doesn't count nearly as much as having perhaps at least 100 hours in the type of aircraft that you're looking for. Some of the other accident factors we mentioned: mechanical problems, long cross-country trips. Some of these folks were buying aircraft more than 1,000 miles away, and that's a long ways to complete an aircraft. And you think about it, often when people do these trips, they're tired. They've been working hard, trying to get the deals negotiated, trying to get all the final squawks taken care of. When they finally jump into the aircraft, they are tired. And also, many of these accident reports noted that they were late departures. So people didn't get on the road as soon as they intended to. And finally, another factor was pressure to complete the trip. And we talked about that before. If you have to be there on Monday, you're more likely to go ahead and forge ahead on a trip, even when you know that you shouldn't. So some of the recommendations that I developed in the presentation were: pilots should get training before they pick up the aircraft with a CFI who is specialized in that particular type of aircraft. Get 5-10 hours of experience in the aircraft you're going to bring home so that you're, totally familiar with it when you jump into it. Also, you want to get an expert pre-purchase inspection. Try and take that aircraft to a shop that specializes in the type of aircraft that you are buying. And lastly, bring a CFI on the trip. Bring someone who's an expert, somebody who can help you with a trip. Now, here's just a quick synopsis of one accident that occurred in my local area here. On March 25th, 2006, an aircraft departed Watsonville for Texas, crashed in Salinas, which can't be more than probably 30, 40 miles away. Witnesses said the pilot arrived at the airport on Friday evening to pick up the accident aircraft, which, by the way, was a Mooney M10 he had just purchased. They said the pilot refused to check out in the new plane and planned to depart after dark in deteriorating weather conditions for his home, stating he needed to be home before Monday. Local pilots convinced him to delay his departure until the following morning. The pilot declined a second offer of a checkout in the aircraft and departed. A pilot-read witness said he spoke with the pilot the morning he departed. While the pilot pre-flighted and refueled the airplane, the witness said he checked local weather via computer. He said weather to the east was not conducive to VFR flight, and he tried to convince the pilot to fly south to avoid the weather and rising terrain to the east. According to the witness, the last thing the pilot asked for before leaving was the identifier of an airport to the southeast, which he input into a handheld GPS unit. Witness said a direct route to that airport would not have taken the pilot far enough south to avoid the weather. The witness said when the plane departed about 9 o'clock in the morning, the ceiling was about 1,600 feet above ground level. Visibility was 5 miles in rain. Aircraft wreckage was located southeast of the departure airport along an approximate direct route to the airport. The pilot entered into the GPS. An FAA aviation safety inspector who had visited the accident site said the airplane impacted in hilly terrain in a nose-low, nearly vertical attitude. Also, I went and found some data that Cirrus has collected. Actually, it's the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association, COPA, on Cirrus fatal accident rates by time and type. So they looked at all 122 fatal accidents that have occurred in the 17-year history of the Cirrus, and they found out how many hours those pilots had in Cirrus aircraft. Now, they were able to do that for 81 of these 122 accidents. For 39 accidents, they don't know how many hours the pilots had in Cirrus aircraft. And when you look at that, for pilots with experience of less than 100 hours, there were 27 of those, which accounted for 33% of the accidents. So 33% of the accidents, people with less than 100 hours in type. If you go to people with 200 hours, then it was 15 of those accidents, so another 19%. So collectively, over 50% of all the fatal accidents occurred with pilots who had less than 200 hours in type in Cirrus aircraft. And so unless you think this is just a Cirrus problem, nope, it's not. This applies just about to every aircraft out there. So if you're buying a new aircraft, I advise please get some training from someone who's not just your friend or not somebody who has 10,000 hours, but somebody who actually has a lot of experience in the aircraft and specializes in that particular aircraft. And then make sure that you get experience in a kind of a safe way in which you gradually expand the envelope. Don't immediately plan, a 1,500-mile trip immediately after you get the aircraft. Work up to that. Try and get your first 100 hours relatively safely so that you can build more experience in the aircraft and be more familiar with it as you gradually start to do more complicated things. So going back to the doctor in Connecticut, apparently he had 1,300 hours. That's a lot of experience, but apparently he also didn't have a lot of experience in the Cirrus aircraft. So make sure you get good training, get it very early in the purchase process, and ideally bring somebody along with you for that long trip home, someone who's got experience in the aircraft. Nothing more tragic to have achieved your life's dream and then to get killed along the way home. On that note, let's transition and talk about listener email. What about these flying cars? Are they for real? And your reviews on iTunes coming up next. And the first email comes from Christopher, who says, Mr. Truscott, I really enjoy your show. I am an aerospace engineering student at Purdue University with my private. I saw an interesting video the other day that got me thinking about the future of general aviation. And he included a link to the video. It was for a company in Germany, which was advertising a distributed electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft for a small number of people. So here are my questions. Do you think aircraft similar to this will be entering the market anytime soon? What are some of the challenges aircraft like this face other than flight time? And if these are introduced, what impact could it have on the general aviation community in general? Well, Christopher, thanks so much for taking the time to write. And, please just call me Max. I've been known as Max my whole life. I barely know who Mr. Truscott would be. So, yes, I think that we are finally poised to see a kind of a big change in this flying car market. But I think it's not going to be quite the way most people have envisioned it. If you go back 50 plus years, people have envisioned a car that they could drive down the road or they could be flying it. And just imagine, for example, that you're flying along, you encounter bad weather, you as a pilot take your flying car to the nearest airport, you then drive onto the highway and you drive the rest of the way home through the rain and snow and other bad weather. I think that form of flying car is probably not really going to be a major factor in the market. There have been a few of those which have been developed, and the problem is you end up with a $250,000-$300,000 flying car that requires a pilot's license, and I just think the market for that is too small. On the other hand, when you look at something that is essentially a vertical takeoff that looks more like drone technology, that is with multiple electric motors and propellers, we're using automated controllers that automatically do most of the flying. Now I think you've got a concept that is more likely to be successful in the market. And part of what's going to make them successful is they're not going to require a pilot's license. They'll be largely automated. They'll be relatively short kind of taxi kinds of stuff. So if you're in New York City and you want to get to JFK Airport, yeah, that's a relatively short distance. And so it's not going to be limited by the short flight times that are available in these aircraft. So you did mention short flight times, which of course relates to battery density. Boy, this is a technology that has been moving so very, very, very slowly. The percentage improvement in battery technology each year is really small compared to what we're used to in the electronic world. The batteries are getting better, but very slowly. So the next big challenge after you get better battery density is just going to be able to have fast recharging of these batteries or to have a very quick swap out of the batteries. Obviously, with today's airplanes, you can refuel them pretty quickly. Any kind of flying car with electric technology, you're going to have to be able to do the same thing as well. What's the impact going to be on general aviation? Well, it's hard to say. I think that these kinds of flying cars that are vertical takeoff that, Uber might use to move you around a city, they probably won't have that much of an impact on general aviation because they probably won't require pilot's license. These will probably be largely self-automated. In terms of electric technology in general, yes, I think that if we have conventional fixed-wing aircraft, something like a Cessna that runs on batteries, that's going to have a huge impact. Now, there are some models out there. I know Pipistrel has a 2-passenger trainer, and I believe they can get up to about an hour on a charge. I think 2 hours is about where we need to be. That way you can really do a good full flight lesson. And when that occurs, now your cost of operation per hour is probably going to be down in the $15 per hour cost as opposed to, $50, $60, $70 an hour per cost using conventional gasoline-powered aircraft. So I think electric training aircraft will have a big impact on GA, but I'm not sure that air taxis like Uber is talking about is going to have that much of an impact on GA. But designing either of these kinds of vehicles, I think, is going to be a great opportunity for someone like you who's studying aerospace engineering. I've got a degree in electrical engineering, and boy, I think engineers rock. So go out there and change the world and have a good time doing it. Next letter here comes from Derek, and Derek had written a couple of weeks ago asking about whether or not Part 135 charter operations were safe. And so we pulled out some statistics to let him know, and he said that those stats you cited this week were very enlightening and point to just how rare accidents like the Hawker nightmare are. Makes him feel more comfortable with the thought of flying with, as he called it, a strange pilot. One other thought I had while listening to the podcast: what are the differences between the different parts? Part 91, Part 135, Part 121. Thanks, Max. Really enjoy listening to your podcast. Well, Derek, that's a really good point. We often throw these numbers around and just assume everybody knows what they are. Part 121, those are going to be the airlines. So if you're looking at a scheduled carrier, any of the big legacy carriers, United, Delta, folks like that, or any of the regional airlines, all going to be Part 121. Part 135 is going to be on-demand charter operation. So these are, you can think of as being non-scheduled aircraft. So they're not regularly flying from one destination to another, but are going wherever the customers want them to go on a kind of a random basis. And there are some scheduled Part 135s like Surf Air here in California, but that's a pretty niche area, kind of a crossover between 135 and 121. And then finally, Part 91, that's what most private pilots fly under when they're flying for their own purposes. Also, some pilots will actually fly for owners. So in other words, an owner may own an aircraft but not want to fly it himself. If they hire a pilot, that pilot is working also under Part 91. So if you're flying yourself or if you're flying someone who owns the airplane that you are flying, then that's all Part 91. Here's an email from Jeff, and he says, a quick story in response to the news item about PIREPs from the episode posted recently. One of the attendees at a nearby IMC Club meeting has an interesting way of passing time when flying. He makes PIREPs, even when the weather is great or as forecasted. The responses he gets from the controllers vary, ranging from pleasant to quite agitated, no doubt because he's, quote, wasting their time. After some time, he checks if his PIREPs show up, and sadly, they usually do not. I'm sure more pilots would report as forecasted conditions if they had a reason to believe that those reports were likely to actually show up. It's a vicious circle. Yes, that's absolutely true. A couple of other comments here. This came from LinkedIn. Mark says, I'm enjoying your new podcast, Max. I like the format, the content, and the professional high-quality presentation. Keep up the good work. Thank you for that. On Facebook, William says, just a quick note to say I'm loving the new podcast and great timing for me on the 182 nose-heavy theory as I start my high-performance and complex training next week. So, William, thanks so much for your comment. Good luck on your training, and don't smack the nose gear on the Cessna 182. Well, let's take a look at iTunes reviews. I want to thank the 11 people who wrote reviews in the last week. So a big thank you to White Lines Blue Skies, Bobble Lisa, Tash Holler, Rigger Runner, Big and Cold Guy, Gabu71, Steve Bauman, gee, I wonder who that is, John Tukey, Shane5125, Baja Doc, and M. Ellis. And let me just read two of those. Big and Cold Guy says, I love the focus on single-engine GA flying. I listened to the segment on becoming a flight instructor 3 times. Well, I think that's great. I hope that we get more flight instructors out of this. I hope people are inspired to go on and get your commercial and then get your flight instructor rating and then pass along your love and passion and knowledge about aviation to the next generation. And this review is from Baja Doc. He says, best GA podcast out there. Well, thanks, Doc. That's the title line below. He says, Max is always clear, concise, and entertaining. Aviation News Talk is a professional quality work matching the professional host. Always my first choice when searching the aviation groups. Well, great. Thank you, gentlemen, for your reviews, and thank you, everyone who took the time to leave a review. And now I just want to ask you to tell all your friends about the podcast. And I noticed this last week on the iPhone that in the lower right-hand corner when you're watching listening to a podcast, podcast, rather, there are 3 dots. And if you tap that, then you can go ahead and click on Share Episode, which then allows you to select Mail or Twitter or Facebook. So go ahead and do that. Share this episode with your friends. Let's go ahead and make this the top aviation podcast. Well, that wraps it up for this week's edition of Aviation News Talk. You can find show notes at aviationnewstalk.com, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, just touch the cover artwork at the top. When you do, you'll find a link where you can record a listener question for me right now over your phone, and I'll use it in a future episode. Or click on the link to send me an email. In the meantime, thanks so much for listening. Fly safely and keep the blue side up.